Hello, welcome to the second webinar of 2021. In this webinar, I'm going to discuss situating methodological challenges to ensure fairness and equity in testing within my view of validity as contextualized and pragmatic explanation. And I'm Bruno Zumbo of the University of British Columbia. The outline today has really three sections that I'd like to describe. The first is bringing to us three big challenges or hurdles when considering methodologies used to ensure fairness and equity in testing and assessment. Where I'm going to go with this section is to really highlight a guiding principle, which is one that I've been influenced by a great deal of work with social sciences, particularly anthropologists and others, philosophers, in which the guiding principle is the many ways to being human. The second part of the outline is situating these three challenges within my view of test, assessment, validity, and validation practices. And I want to be clear, by here I mean tests, assessments, surveys, all of those sorts of systematic empirical methods of gathering data. The approach that I bring to in terms of validity is contextualized and pragmatic explanation, and really its implications for validation practice. The third section and final section is looking at fairness and equity, and in particular bringing forward on the ecological model of item and test responding that emerges out of the situated view that I have of validity and of the three big challenges. Throughout, this is actually a sort of a look back and a conceptualization of a line of my research to date, going back to about 2000. So we're looking about 21 years. And I wanted to sort of recast and reconnect and show the connection among this line of work that I've been involved in and that I've been leading. And in this context, you'll see citations throughout the slides that sort of guide you to different studies, chapters, papers that I've published with colleagues and on my own. So throughout, I used the metaphor of a hurdler, with some hurdles being more easily cleared. And in contrast, others, we collectively as a community of scholars have, and really until very recently, successfully skirted any of these hurdles. And so I really want to use this notion of a hurdler, clearing a hurdle, taking on a hurdle, training for a hurdle, preparing to clear these hurdles. I think these challenges are kind of hurdles of varying difficulty. We'll try and use it where we can. You'll see here that for much of the history of assessment and testing, we really have skirted these hurdles entirely. It's actually a very nice paper published in 2019 led by Pamela Wojciech, myself, and Ruben Fernandez Alonso in the journal Psychometrics that actually talks in many ways about many of these hurdles. There we're talking within a multi-level view of model explanation, but at the beginning you can see how we're conceptualizing validity, how we're conceptualizing these challenges and equity and fairness. So let me give you a summary of the three big challenges or hurdles that I would like to highlight. There are other smaller challenges, but I thought I would highlight these, the three of the bigger ones, and like I said, there are others. So the first one that's a sort of a conceptual methodological challenge when we start talking about equity and diversity is it's the following. It says, to what extent are we measuring our attribute or competency of interest with a test, assessment, or survey in use? And this recognizes that when we go about and do measurement or survey design, we're actually implicitly, whether we wish to acknowledge it or not, we are actually measuring other minor attributes. So to what extent are we measuring our attribute or competency of interest? So in a math, very simple example, in a math problem solving, um, the individual who's reading the assessment needs some sense of reading ability, some capacity of reading ability. So you're measuring more than just mathematics in a pure sense. And one would almost argue that kind of problem solving is situated within the capacity to read. So you cannot actually strip it away and say, the real question is, to what extent are we measuring our attribute or competency of interest? In that case, it would be a math assessment. The second big challenge are, what are the implicit and explicit conceptions of fairness and equity of the methodology of my particular choice, my methodology of choice? The response I have to that is my approaches embody statistical and psychometric models and an ecological model of item and test performance that you'll see a little later. In many ways, what I'm talking about here is, by observing the test situation, we hope to identify clues about the way the test is constructed, understood, and performed as a social occasion. So now the statistical models that I'm developing and working on, and some of them we've already published a little bit on some of them, they really try and look at the testing situation, the ecology, as you'll hear about it later in today's presentation. And so in doing so, we hope to identify clues about the way the test is constructed, understood, and performed as a social occasion. You'll see the language of anthropology in some of my thinking. I've been influenced a great deal by people like Brian Maddox and others, as I begin, including also Camilla Adi, who you'll see, there's a citation there on our paper, Assembled Validity. You're seeing me being influenced and growing into that sort of work, as well as staying within my own strengths of sort of mathematical and statistical models of testing and item responding. The third big challenge or hurdle is how are my conceptions of fairness and equity informed by the school demographics, logic, or organization of the Canadian education system, and shaped by Canadian social values as I live them. Here, I'm really talking about educational testing, but it's more broadly if I'm doing language assessment, psychological assessment. They're all situated within different ecologies and different types of demographics and logics and organizations and systems. And so here, if I'm talking about educational testing, is how are my conceptions of fairness and equity informed by the school demographics, logic, or organization of the Canadian education system, and shaped by Canadian social values as I live them? And I really talk about Canadian social values here, Canadian education system, and it would be different for different countries. Response? Well, really, it's asking the question, to what extent might we be measuring unintentionally other unimportant constructs that are not meant to be included in our inferences of our attribute or domain of interest? And so they're only unimportant because they are not the focus of our attribute. Of course, we can't strip them away. It's like the math problem solving and reading ability. There's no such thing as stripping them away. That's the other part of the recognition of this, is that they are situated, they're bathed in this. To remove them, in fact, creates an artificial setting. And in fact, that the domain that you're measuring is quite different. So here is, to what extent might we be measuring unintentionally other unimportant constructs that are not meant to be included in our inferences of our attribute or domain of interest, such as conformity to expected cultural norms, for example, related to, for example, multiculturalism, ethnicity, gender identity, and gender roles. We'll see a series of citations where we try and unpack some of these ideas. And what this begins to acknowledge is that situated ecological notion of a psychometric theory, a methodology for thinking about equity and fairness. There are the fundamental principle that that governs my thinking is that there are many ways to be human. I'm not the first to acknowledge to talk about this principle. The principle, however, as I see it, is that there are many ways to be human, and that this principle is at the core of how I live and I theorize and how I express my Canadian experience and identity. I say this because it's, first of all, about me as a theorist and how I, in fact, live my life. And it's not just about theorizing, but also I'm situated within the values of my community. So if I'm doing, if I'm interested in multilingual elements, I think of it within the context that I live in, right? And if you're curious in these kinds of ideas, contrast notions like melting pot versus sort of multicultural kind of notions. So here, I am really trying to express the many ways of being human, how I approach my theorizing. I've made interesting observations over the last 30 years in my experience has been that the field of psychometrics per se has tended to go into a sort of a moral panic over gender identity, gender expression, and aspects of cultural expression as it influences testing and measurement. That's been so fascinating to me to watch it, the sort of reviews I get back, correspondence I get back from authors when I address these sorts of things publicly at conferences or when I give invited addresses at universities or institutes around the world. It's fascinating to, it's almost a sense of moral panic. Why are we concerning ourselves with things like gender identity, gender expression, and aspects of cultural expression? I don't know how to answer that question, except to say, how could you not, within my theorizing, within the way I think about assessment, the ecological views of assessment? In 2015, I gave an address in Glasgow, one of the keynote addresses at the AEA Europe conference, the Association of Educational Assessment Europe conference, and it's an online video you can see at my website. And in that context, I really began to highlight the notion of in vivo versus in vitro notions and views of assessment. And that historically, we have been looking at this in vitro notion, isolating it. Well, instead, I'm moving my thinking towards an in vivo situated ecological view. The core of my theorizing and the methods I develop and or advocate for, they aim to challenge this view, this moral panic, this notion of an under glass or in vitro, right? The core of my theorizing, and the methods I develop is to challenge that and to advocate for an approach in which we are trying to capture the human experience more broadly through an ecological view. These are the core elements that of how I try and conceptualize matters around equity and fairness. It's connected. How I think about equity and fairness issues are deeply connected to how I think about validity. Not all validity theorists try and blend these together. Some people who try and make matters of consequences, fairness, as something separate. Instead, I have, since at least about 1999, 2000, have been writing a series of papers, published a series of papers and conference addresses, in which I try and present validity as a contextualized and pragmatic explanation, and the implications of which are connected to equity and fairness deeply in those principles I begin with. In 2009, in a book chapter of mine, I think I really began to introduce a depiction of sort of an integrated cognitive judgment and the integrated cognitive judgment in the contextualized and pragmatic explanation view of validity and validation that I've been bringing forward. And this picture from that 2009 this image from 2009 actually captures it fairly well. It still does to this day. It looks at validity, which is to establish the why and how. The source, variables, mediators, moderators, etc. That is validity. In connected with this larger cognitive judgment, you have this dominant part of validity, utility, use, predictability, sensitivity, specificity. You see the psychometrics, and they all butt up against each other to form this integrative cognitive judgment, including social consequences, justice, and fairness, all of it together. So you can, then what I was trying to portray here is that social consequences, justice, fairness, psychometrics, utility, all shape validity, and validity shapes those as well. It's an integrated whole, right? I, for the moment, have dashed circles around them to try and separate them, but they're actually an integrative whole. And the notions, you can see the sort of how they would move and shape and form and inform each other. That's the basic idea that I try to this integrative cognitive judgment. Well, let me say a few words about validity as contextualized and pragmatic explanation, and really to talk a bit about its implications for test validation practice. And furthermore, you will see its implications for how I think about and analyze and conceptualize matters of fairness and equity. First, it's important that you note that I'm separating validity from the process or elements of validation. Validity involves for me, validity involves establishing an explanation for the observed score variation, item level, subtest level, or test level, any of those. It's about establishing an explanation for the observed score variation. It's, of course, an old tradition in philosophy of science. It's looking at an explanatory view. In the mid-1950s, in psychology, particularly psychometrics, Crombeck and Meehl brought this idea most clearly to the measurement community by drawing on a form of a sort of a Hempel-Oppenheim deductive nomological model of explanation. They brought that Hempel-Oppenheim approach, this deductive nomological approach of explanation, for measurement validity in what Crombeck and Meehl called construct validity in a nomological network. If you look at the Crombeck and Meehl paper in the mid-1950s, that's, and you sort of situate it within the philosophy of science of the time, influenced by the work of scholars like Herb Fagel and others, who would have influenced Meehl a great deal at the University of Minnesota. That's bringing explanation to the forefront. Of course, Crombeck and Meehl are in fact reflecting their own approach that's rooted in a sort of neo-behavioralist tradition. And my own work in the last approximately 20 years has challenged the Crombeck and Meehl view to some extent, still staying within the notion of explanation, but not Hempel-Oppenheim kind of deductive nomological model of explanation. So part of the problem with the Crombeck and Meehl approach is that it was rooted, given it's the 1950s, it was rooted in a neo-behaviorist tradition of conflating explanation and confirmation, as well as suffering of what Michael Scriven later clearly articulated, these concerns with the Hempel-Oppenheim deductive nomological model. So, it's conflating the sort of tradition of confirmation and explanation. Plus, their notion is still within this, if you wish, post-positive approach of deductive nomological sort of approach to it. Hempel-Oppenheim is classic in the philosophy of science when we think about explanation. I've espoused a different explanatory view. My roots are more firmly in a pragmatic approach, and particularly in an inference to the best explanation, that kind of strategy. IBE, inference to best explanation type approach is really what are abductive than abductive strategy. I kind of fall more in that view, influenced by various philosophies of science that I've in some cases studied under, in other cases I spent a great deal of time working closely with the work that they're doing. So I'm less, 1955, Hempel, and more sort of more of a pragmatic, inference to the best explanation kind of approach. Although I'm not a diehard um, IBE specialist, but I do lean a lot more into that direction. You'll see me, all right? Second, in separating validity per se from validation process, then I have clearly have a sense of the role of social consequences, justice and fairness in the validation process. And so I separate it from validity itself. This is this recognizes that measurement is really a power tool in public debate and public policy. Here I'm reflecting an interesting observation made by Professor Elena Shohami when I gave my Messick address at the on the award of the Messick Award to me by the International Language Testing Association and the Language Testing Research Conference, the colloquium. There, yeah, when I gave that address, I heard Elena really kind of remind me of the fact that measurement and tests are really power tools. That's a term she used, and I really like it. So now I really always bring in consequences in, and you'll see that, and that's always been the case, but I really am committed to that. But in looking at validity and validation, I'm really taking this more pragmatic explanationist point of view, explanatory point of view. There are other people that are down this road. There's some Denny Boersboom as a more causal for sort of language, and it's a very fascinating approach that he takes. It actually falls in line with the Crombeck and Meal, my own view, Boersboom, to some extent, as I talked about in that chapter in 2009. We kind of come together looking at explanation. In Denny's case, it's causation as a type of explanation. Crombeck and Meal reflecting the mid-1950s, sort of a Hempel Oppenheimer or sort of Hempel sort of approach to it, this deductive nomological. While I'm more into sort of more pragmatic, capital P, pragmatic sort of approach, that's really also influenced a lot by a notion of explanation that is wider. And it looks at for the best explanation. It's not just purely, in a very narrow sense, driven by only one notion of what explanation might be in a very narrow sense. The basic idea underlying my explanatory approach is that if one could understand why an individual responded in a certain way to an item or scored a particular value on a scale or on a test, then one would go a long way toward bridging the inferential gap between the test scores, or even the latent variable scores, and the constructs. So the construct being, if you wish, the phenomena of interest. The score is the observed score on a survey or a test, and the latent variable score is a sort of model implied predictive score on a latent variable, a random effect, if you wish, that's constructed from a model. So latent variable is constructed from the model. And so this having an understanding of why and an explanation goes a long way toward bridging the inferential gap between the test scores or even of the factor score or theta score in IRT, either one of those, the gap between those and the construct. And to me, that's what validation is fundamentally about. According to this view, validity per se is not established until one has an explanatory model of the variation in item responses and or scale scores, and the variables mediating, moderating, and otherwise affecting the response outcome. There's no doubt this is a tall hurdle. Indeed. However, I believe it's also in the spirit of Crombeck and Meal's 1955 a work to require explanation in what some authors would call a strong form of construct validity. To me, that is construct validity. A weak form of construct validity is just correlating and having as many validities as there are correlations. between your variable and something that you think it either predicts or it either predicts, postdicts, or even is just related at that time. Some people call that a weak form of construct validity. I don't find that very interesting at all. Certainly, there are correlations, and that correlation informs explanation. And there are distinctions in the philosophy of science about prediction and explanation, and when are they the same thing. We can set that all aside for the moment. I'm really pushing for explanation, and that the explanatory model of the variation in the item responses or the scale scores, those explanations, I think, are the key element of how I think of validity per se. Overlooking the importance of explanation in validity, we have, as a discipline, focused overly heavily on the validation process, and as a result, I think we've lost our way. And here I distinguish validity from validation, which is the process of gathering evidence to support the validity claims. And so this distinction is very important. And a lot of what we've been doing for the last 30 or 40 years is working on the validation process, but we haven't, a lot of that doesn't really situate on what we're trying to establish. I mean, how often do you see new approaches towards validation, some techniques, some statistical method, even some more qualitative approach? And I kind of wonder, so what are they trying to achieve with this method? What is validity for them? And so for me, I say, here's how I establish. I put a pin. I say, this is what I think of validity. Validity is about an explanatory model, explanation. It can be statistical. And there's a variety of notions of explanations. I prefer this idea of building these sort of, inference to the best explanation. You'll see some of my work. It's a nice chapter by Jake Stone and I. Some years ago, about 7 or 8 years ago, in which we worked this through in a lot more detail. The notion is that the explanation is our target, what we're trying to do, and that the validation processes are really about firming up and establishing that explanation, testing that explanation. This is not to suggest that the activities of the process of validation, such as correlations with a criterion convergent measure, dimensionality assessment, item responding, or differential item or test function are irrelevant or should be stopped. Quite to the contrary. I mean, I've spent decades working on some of the methodology, statistical methods for doing exactly that. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we stop those and that they're irrelevant. Quite the opposite. It's about conceptualizing them with a purpose. Why are we modeling? What is the focus of the model? Why are we looking at response processes and response processes as validation, not just response processes for, getting some very important features about things like timing and other, but I'm really talking about always focused on building and testing explanatory views of the item responding. So quite to the contrary, the activities of the process of validation must serve the definition of validity, where mine is validity as contextualized and pragmatic explanation is what I think of. That's validity. My aim is to refocus our attention on why we are conducting all of these psychometric analyses, that is to support our claim of the validity of our inferences from a given measure. Shortening that inferential gap is another aspect of it. So for example, in 2007, I highlighted conducting test and item bias. It's not just about protecting the test developer or test user against lawsuits. That's in a paper of mine that's gotten a great deal of attention entitled 3 Generations of Differential Item Functioning, or DIF Analyses. That was in Language Assessment Quarterly in 2007. So I highlighted in there, it's not just about, it might be, but it's not just about that. Conducting test and item bias analyses, differential item function, other class of approaches, dimensionality analyses, multi-group confirmatory factor, all of these is also a statistical methodology that ferrets out invalidity, that distorts the meaning of test results for some groups of examinees and thus establishes the inferential limits or bounds of the claims that we can make from the test. That to me is very important. It's not just about some fiducial legal sort of responsibility. It's actually also about that ferreting out invalidity that distorts the meaning of test results for some groups of examinees, and this establishes our limits and bounds of our claims and inferences. One of the limitations of traditional quantitative test validation practices, factor analysis, validity coefficients, multi-trait, multi-method approaches, is that they're descriptive rather than explanatory. In 2014, narrative volume by Eric Chan and I, you'll see chapter after chapter in which there were, surveys of validation practices. And the most common ones were, factor analytic approach, validity coefficients, correlation with some other variable, and a little bit of multi-trait, multi-method approaches, but they're all descriptive rather than explanatory. The aim of my explanatory approach is to lay the groundwork to expand the evidential basis for test validation by providing a richer explanation of the processes of responding to tests and variation, the test scores and item scores, hence promoting a richer psychometric theory building. To be honest, I am trying to bring explanation to the forefront of psychometrics. In my opinion, that moves it to a science of psychometrics. Explanation is one of the sort of hallmarks that I look at or I think about when I think of science, is an explanatory focus. It's one of, it's not the only hallmark, but I like to see this aspiration, this desire, this working towards explanation in the broadest term, not just causal, not just statistical, not just path analytic, not just explanation in its richest, broader terms written about in the philosophy of science. And that to me is a richer psychometric theory building and really moving towards a science of psychometrics. Well, fairness and equity is now framed within this notion. Don't forget what we've gone so far. I talked about some values, the many ways of being human, and the notions of how these big problems that I'm trying to tackle. Now I really want to bring it down to this equity and fairness as just one example of this. And here I want to highlight the ecological model of item and test responding that actually emerged formally in 2015 by myself and a group of my research collaborators and graduate students in the journal Language Assessment Quarterly in 2015. You'll see a reference to it in a moment. But it builds by my sort of first, second, third generation of TIFF. So let me say a few words and you'll see now how my framework for validity and testing and rich theorizing and contextual notions, pragmatic explanations, now come into even framing fairness and equity from this point of view, at least like psychometric fairness and equity. So in the studies of fairness, gender has, in the main, been characterized as as binary and as biological sex, where in binary biological sex differences on item performance, they're eventually explained by item characteristics such as item format and item content. This is gender drift, gender bias has been an important area of study, but if you think of it as sort of a case, gender has been characterized in the binary as biological sex, MF differences, male-female differences on test performance. And then those are eventually explained by item characteristics or item format, item content. What I described in 2007 as my third generation diff, gender per se is more properly should be considered a social construction, and gender differences in item performance are explained by contextual or situational variables, ecological variables, if you wish, such as institutionalized gender roles, classroom sizes, economic socioeconomic status, teaching practices, parenting styles in terms of the students, and identity of a test taker, and the identity in many cases of a teacher, if you're looking at an educational context, and the interactions thereof. Now gender is no longer just MF, now it should be thought of as a social construction that is in fact, the differences on this reflect item performance in a much richer way. We believe, or I believe, that these richer ecological variables have been largely ignored. And I use gender diff as an example of this, right? What gender diff is typically seen as is that, you see MF biological differences and the test taker, and it's just binary. It's just the binary. Now, what I'm talking about is not something, and this is very rich tradition in sociology, anthropology, educational theory, curriculum theory, human development. It's moving beyond the binary of biological sex and looking at gender identity. Then, because what's done historically is they do these sort of MF differences. They might do Mantel-Hansel test, logistic regression, SIB test, whatever you want. And then they look at item content, item format, and say, oh, that explains the MF biological differences. Uninteresting to me. To me, we need, what I'm looking at is more contextual or situational variables, these ecological variables, if you wish, such as, for example, institutionalized gender roles. And how does play and socioeconomic status, right? Sexual minority status, race differences, and identity in there. I mean, these elements and these complexities and intersectionalities, I think, are a far richer way of theorizing. So I believe that these more richer ecological variables have been large, and they have been largely ignored because the focus on item, test format, content, somewhat on cognitive processes, but these cognitive processes are not particularly elaborated or situated cognition. And even test dimensionality that is pervasive in this, what I was looking at as a second generation of DIF in 2007. In 2015, we began to introduce this ecological model of item and test responding. This is a broader model than just diff. It's to say, how do we look at performance? And we see here, influenced somewhat by a Bronfenbrenner sort of view of, and Bronfenbrenner is a good place to start. It's not the end for us in the sort of view of explanatory conceptualization, but it's a darn good place for us to start. And you look at personal characteristics, item test, and test setting is in here. You'll see there's an educational context. You'll see classroom and school context, the family ecology, or other outside of school ecology. Yes, children, not only school children, are not only in the classroom, and characteristics of the educational system. So if you're doing, and this is only one way of conceptualizing it, right? This is it's an instantiation. There's a variety of ways, depends what if you're looking at language testing for immigration purposes. These are adults. The different levels. There may be fewer sort of dashed ovals here. These objects, and they may mean different things, but the notion is to sort of conceptualize it in this way. This is not the model of ecology. It's an instantiation of the ecological model of item and test. In this case, it's educational testing. So what my approach to fairness and equity implies? Well, so as has been noted by others in the bias literature, the traditional views follow a sort of social address model of criterion prediction and group difference. This is this spills over into test validation for looking at group differences. And using the common social address approach to group comparison, classification into groups might be confused with fixed biological or ethnic classification. And as I've been reminded in reading some of the bias literature on fairness and testing, I love the quotation of the philosopher John Stuart Mill, who in 1848 wrote, "Of all the vulgar modes of escaping the consideration of the effect of social moral influences on the mind, the most vulgar is attributing the diversities of conduct and character to inherent natural attributes." In some senses, this can be read as fundamentally, this can be modified as a fundamentally a critique of, biological MS, MF, male, female differences on test performance, right? Where we're attributing the diversities of conduct and character to inherent natural differences, the social address kind of approach. And I think that's fundamentally problematic. That's what I'm working against. What my approach implies is that we need to look at the identifying the determinants or explanatory theory of task, item, test score variation, and the explanation is the basis of a strong validity claims. So it's not about looking at inherent biologic differences. It's instead looking at determinants, explanatory theories. I have an ecological systems approach, so you'll see those sort of different levels if you look at Bronfenbrenner's of it. But those can be formed in any way, right? In any way, but I'm looking for an explanation. Most research, for example, in response processes focuses on cognitive factors. My colleague and I in 2017, we've taken a broader view of response process. Here's something else that my view towards fairness implies, a broader view of response processes, right? That Hubley and I introduced, and I embrace the notion of assessment in vivo to shine a spotlight on test takers' behavior, stance, gesture, motivation, and affect, besides the cognition. This is heavily influenced by my colleague Brian Maddox. So we're now looking at implications for my approach that now broaden for richer theorizing, not as John Stuart Mill would say, this sort of social address approach in which we're attributing differences to some inherent natural differences. What my approach to fairness and equity implies? Well, now there's a political context, consequences of testing, assessment data usage, and matters of social justice are at the core of my view and have been since about 2007, 2005. You can see earlier into late 1990s, you see the beginnings of it, but more formally and loudly in that early work. And so matters of social justice, or equity and fairness, consequences, political context, data usage, all connected to equity and fairness. Typically, the outcome of a test or assessment serves multiple purposes. One needs to validate each of the various uses, if you're doing well-being, language, whatever you're looking at for different stakeholders. My approach highlights response processes, explanation of the task item or test variation in vivo. So now what? Well, we go back to the beginning. Do not skirt these hurdles. There's a lot of challenges here. Do not skirt them. We're developing a theory building. We're developing ways of doing modeling, statistical modeling. We're ways of doing cognitive modeling, ways of doing ethnographic kind of work. Brian Maddox and I talked about, ethnographic psychometrics or psychometric ethnography in a paper of ours in the International Journal of Testing. We describe this as stuff. More sophisticated, richer theory building, complex models of the impact of the ecology of item and test responding. That's what we're demanding now. A well thought out research program needs to be established and funded to address these issues. And we can use assessment outcomes, but we need to get going on this research program to support the inferences we tend to make with them. We also need to follow some of the a more rigorous way of thinking about group comparisons. We'll often see in international assessments, we pick country A and country B, and very much within depending who you want to give your presentation to, who you want to publish, US versus some other country. Or you may, and these countries are really the amazing thing about international assessments may have 20, 15, 20 countries. And it's like, it's a way of kind of sort of a salami cutting up diff studies and equity studies. We need to get away from that and begin to look at these countries simultaneously if you're doing international forms of assessment. And even our co-publication guidelines are really clear that we shouldn't be cutting up these into pairs, this sort of salami publishing. This needs to stop. And we need to have a richer notion of country classification, and not forgetting that within group, heterogeneity also can happen. All of this comes out of my thinking and theorizing. I'm not the only one who's thinking this way, but please do not read or hear what I'm saying. It's me, the only one who's doing this. But I'm trying to I present you a sort of a more complete package is what I'm trying to do, of theorizing values, how I approach it, and modeling within a view of validity, a particular view of validity that I have there, this explanation, explanatory view of validity. What the view of validity and explanation implies for studies of fairness and equity in testing and assessment, well, a few more elements is that examples of mine that I'm interested in and we've been doing work on is investigate if and how race, gender, and culture as related to the object of measurement, students, communities, schools, how that may shape and alter the inferences one makes from testing or assessment outcomes. But doing work on this kind of view, one needs to investigate the role of various levels of measurement in sort of a multi-level view of validation, because we've expanded this view to a multi-level view of validation, where the inferences you may measure students, for example, but your actual claims aren't about students. State assessments have this, and provincial examinations are often this case, is that, but not always, is that they really are not for individual statement. NAEP is a good example in the United States, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. NAEP is not about making any statements about any individual student who takes an assessment. It's about comparing states, districts, et cetera, or even, and even across time. So we have a multi-level notion. Well, we need to look at these multiple levels together. In 2017, we did some of this. I want to thank you all for listening in. I hope this was of interest. Here's a citation for today's work. It's sort of a summary looking at. We'll be continuing the webinar series. I'm hoping for about one a month, maybe even one every 3 weeks or so, that are webinars on various themes of this program of research. The UBC Paragon agreement, funded also through, which is my Paragon professorship, but also funded through my Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Psychometrics and Measurement as well. Thank you very much.